Welcome to History 2020. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'm your professor in my new guest bedroom setup, although you don't even know that. Welcome to History 2020. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Hopefully we all make it. Good news. It's kind of hard to do good news on this, but I'll say my good news is my wife took my son on a walk. So this house is mine. This castle is mine for the next 45 minutes. What's up? I'm running the show and it feels good. So let's talk about history. Let's catch up. Last time we were in the class, you may recall, I think I brought this up in the discussion sessions for those of you guys who were there. Nazis on the rise, the Soviet Union on the rise, and all of these things really making people feel like maybe there was an end to the liberal democratic order. So what we're looking at now is the fact that a lot of the world begins to think that this is it, that capitalism's over, that democracy's over, and that the only way to survive this depression is going to be to abandon those and go with a totally new way of doing things and abandoning the old style. The presidents that are going to serve during the Depression are going to have to try to deal with it. And as you'll see, one does a better job of that than the other. So just to where we left off, the Depression hits, right? 29, is the Great Crash, but that's not what does it. That's just a symptom. There were already signs of it that were there before. Just to put this in context, U.S. GDP drops by about 25% in 3 years. By 1932, total unemployment hit around 25%. About a third of American farmers lose their land. And one of the crazy things about this is, you know how the entire class we've been talking about how people are moving out of the country and then they're going into the cities, right? We've talked about that. It's been a huge movement. In the first couple of years of the Depression, people leave the cities and go out to the country to try and farm. And you saw what's already going on in a lot of the countryside when you looked at the Dust Bowl documentary. I mean, that Dust Bowl hits, and it couldn't be worse timing in terms of the greater economy because there's nothing really that anyone can do to find work. So people are trying to go back and farm. They're trying to figure out a way to eat. And at that same time, there's a huge crisis in terms of the agricultural economy. And it just makes things worse. So Herbert Hoover is the guy who is in office. You may recall him being the one who gave like his speech when he got the nomination, being like, "We're closer than ever to having some form of a great life, basically closer than ever to having all of our needs fulfilled." And this guy, he says that, and a couple months later, everything tanks. So he's got to figure out how to deal with this. And the thing about Hoover, I don't know if you remember when I talked about him in class, but Hoover is a guy who is really you call him a self-made man. The guy really worked hard to get where he was, and he really believed that people should take care of their own needs, that the government shouldn't do that. He was a true believer in the 1920s style system, even if he was, by most accounts, a far more humane person than a lot of other presidents, that we'd had in that era, or even overall. I mean, you look at his track record, the guy is a pretty good person in terms of what he does in his life. But he doesn't want to go in and do anything to directly help people. And throughout his term, which he's going to be up for election in 1932, even Congress, which is controlled by Republicans, will say, we want to pass a program to help workers, and Hoover will veto it. It's not until 1932 that he finally agrees to fund what's called like a work program, basically government works projects. Like, can you guys think of a giant dam out somewhere near Las Vegas that is named after Hoover? Yeah, okay, that was obvious. It was the Hoover Dam. Side note on that, you guys know the Hoover Dam made Vegas, right? Did you guys know that? They set up the Hoover Dam out there. All these rough and tumble guys move out to the middle of the desert. They're out there looking for something to do. The people who are running the work site are like, obviously you can't drink when they first start doing it because of prohibition. And as I told you before in the class, where single men with money go, prostitution follows. And the people who ran the actual work sites were pretty tight and wouldn't let a lot of that go on out there around the dam. So some people moved in and set up some gambling and some brothels not too far away from where they were building the Hoover Dam so that those people could come there. Voila, Las Vegas. That's the origins of it. You ever been to Las Vegas before? You guys have anybody? Yeah, yeah, Las Vegas. Las Vegas. Yeah, Lindsay. Don't. Uh, the slogan from Las Vegas is everybody's story goes like this. Man, I was up. Just wait for it because, as my friend Steven told me, that city ain't built on winners. So yeah, Isaac, you've been in the airport. It does count because they got freaking slot machines in the airport. But anyway, Isaac, you're not old enough to do it anyway. I know you. Anyway, so Hoover Dam is a part of the project there, but he still refuses to have any direct aid, like direct support, go to people. And this is just a part of his principle. I mean, people, let me tell you about what history teaches us. Things change, and when things change, you have to have new ideas. And the problem is that when new ideas, you put them in place, the ideas work. Out of that comes what we call an ideology, which ideas are good. Ideology is a belief that the solutions will work no matter what. The idea that they're universal. And so the thing to remember is that good ideas, they need to change as conditions change. Ideologies kind of take ideas that worked at one time, put them into a mold, and generally people just follow them even when the conditions change. But usually after a while, people will actually drop the ideology. It just keeps people trying the same solutions over and over again long after they work. So just a little life lesson there that might come up and be useful here. So throughout the country, people who are unemployed are moving into these shanty towns. They're called Hoovervilles. That's what people call them. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, and poor Hoover, I mean, he's not like he was like moving to shanties made out of cardboard and wood. Like Hoover was a decent person. He didn't want it to happen, but he's getting the blame. You guys pay attention to that. Presidents often get the blame when something happens and the credit when something good happens. But usually there are bigger things at work. But Hoover doesn't do much. Now, by 32, Hoover is starting to change his thinking. As I said, he finally signs into law a works program to help people go to work. But that really doesn't help him much because I'll just tell you. 1932, the same time that he's up for election, the same year that he eventually signs that into law, veterans who have lost everything, World War I veterans from across the country who are desperate, they start demanding early payment on what comes to be called the bonus. Remember, at this time, there's no Social Security. Nobody has anything to retire on. But World War I veterans were promised a one-time payout in 1945 for their service. That way they'd have something to retire on. And there's no Social Security at this time, so it's a big deal. But these soldiers start saying, we ain't going to make it to 45 if we starve to death. We got nothing now. And they start asking and petitioning the government to pay them early. In the summer of 1932, thousands of these folks march to D.C. In carpools, they figure out ways to get there, and they set up Hoovervilles all over D.C., even right up outside the White House. And what they're asking for is, pay us this bonus early. Right? You're going to give it to us in 45 anyway. Just give it to us now. We served our country. We earned this. All we're asking for is it early. All right? So that's what they're asking for. Now let's play What Would You Do? Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, you're Hoover. It's 1932. It's not looking real good in an election year. You have thousands of soldiers who are camped out on the White House lawn. You ready for this? Let's do a class survey, okay? Okay? You're the president. The bonus armies are outside. Veterans on your lawn. These folks who fought World War I. And they're asking for payment. Okay? Multiple choice, all right? By show of hands, all right? How many of you guys would offer the soldiers partial payment now and the rest later? That sounds like a decent plan, right? Okay, yeah. That's A. How about B, pay them now, but with a penalty for withdrawing early, kind of like an IRA, right? There we go. C, pay them the total sum to boost morale in the middle of a depression and in the middle of an election year. That's C. Okay? Or how many of you guys would choose D, just use the military to crush them? All right. What do you guys think? How many of you guys think? A, B, C? Anybody thinking D? It's an election year. Nah, yeah, that sounds like a terrible idea, right? Why would I even put it there? Because that's what he does. He sends out basically and the sad thing is Hoover was worried about his security of them being so close to the White House. It wasn't like it is now where there's a huge wall around it. So he wanted them cleared off. But the guy he put in charge of getting rid of them, you might have heard of this guy if you know anything about World War II. It's a guy named Douglas MacArthur, who, if you know anything, is not he's not prone to doing things a little bit. He ends up going out, clearing off the White House, going across the river. One of the soldiers dies. It is a terrible, terrible decision, and a lot of that has to do with the way it's carried out. It really drives home the idea that Hoover is not sympathetic to people. It's terrible for him. Side note, one of the guys who was serving under MacArthur when this happened, a guy who basically was like following the orders, but said later on that it was a terrible idea. That guy's name was Dwight Eisenhower. And, as you guys may know now, I think history proves that Eisenhower was the one you listen to in moments of crisis, even if MacArthur was a pretty fierce general, you know? All right, so he does this, and in 1932, he's going to run for re-election. All right, so this is where FDR shows up, in the class anyway. FDR had been a major player in politics for a while. You guys remember another Roosevelt we talked about? Anybody? Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt. It's like his fifth cousin. You know how Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Remember I told you that? And then one day the secretary went out and he changed the world, basically. Well, FDR had also served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He had run on the vice presidential ticket for the Democrats in 1920 and not won. He's really involved in New York politics, but in 1932, this guy gets the nomination for the Democrats. And not too hard to beat Hoover, honestly. After years of vetoing things, even though he turned it around, people wanted someone who was going to use government to help them. And at first, a lot of people, as I said, with ideologies, a lot of people believe that, if I just work hard, I'll make it. I mentioned in class before that in many ways the New Deal is a crisis of masculinity. People believe that if they work hard, they can get something. And then after years of looking at the unemployment rate and the horrible state of the economy, people will eventually begin to realize this isn't my fault. And so when FDR says the government can help people, you see people believe that and people invest. This pendulum, you guys remember there's like Gilded Age where there's like very little government involvement, and then Progressive Era, and then boom, Teddy Roosevelt busting trusts and like passing the FDA and all that, or the Pure Food and Drug Act and all that. And then boom, the 1920s, small government goes away, and then boom, we're going to go back the other way. FDR runs in 32. Just a little background on him as well. In 1921, at age 39, he contracted polio and more or less lost the use of his legs. He could still use them somewhat, but an interesting side story to this whole thing is that throughout his time in office, he goes in front of people to speak. And when he does, if you look at almost any video, has anybody watched the Dust Bowl video yet that I assigned you guys? Yeah. So if you watch that, remember on the second part, I have you open up on an FDR speech from 1936 where he's in North Dakota. If you look at that, you'll see the way that he dealt with it. So FDR, if you notice, is standing arm in arm with a younger guy on the back of that train while he's giving the speech. And that essentially what that guy is doing is holding him up and helping him stand there. He'll walk arm in arm with people up to pedestals when he's giving speeches, and then he can lean on it. But really, it's amazing. I don't like to go into the whole, like, it used to be a better day and whatever happened to these people, blah, 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 that whole, like, old-timer thing where it's like this country used to be great. I don't like to go into that whole spiel, but I will say it's hard to imagine a world in which you have someone who has a disability like that and no one says anything, in today's world. But also, we got, anyway, just watch a presidential debate sometime and ask yourself if you think someone would be able to have that. Anyway, all right, moving on. FDR runs in 32. And this guy, it's funny because you guys know about the whole first 100 days thing, right? Like FDR is the guy, first 100 days, changes policy. Comes in there and cleans house. And the New Deal, right? He promises a New Deal. And I think most people, certainly I did when I was younger, you get the idea that like, oh yeah, this guy had a plan the whole time. Like he was like, I'm going to do this and this and this. But the reality is in 32, he promised a New Deal, but he didn't really give many specifics. FDR actually ends up relying on a bunch of experts around him for the ideas. And that's generally a pretty good idea. Find the person who knows the problem the best, and they'll give you the best solution a lot of the time. The one thing he was clear about, though, guys, the one thing that he was clear about was that it was time for a drink. And when he runs in 1932, him and the Democratic Party are like, hey, you guys, you know how you haven't had alcohol in 13 years? JK, you know how you're funding the mafia in cities and you know how this isn't working? If you elect me and the Democrats, we will get rid of prohibition. And that is very quickly what happens. That's when you get the 21st Amendment. But even before the amendment passes, they change the legislation surrounding it to allow for some degree of alcohol sales to happen anyway. So if you like drinking, you can thank FDR. If you don't like drinking, you don't have to. So there you go. Make your own decisions. All right, so he comes in. This guy FDR comes in, and I can't say this enough, FDR destroys Hoover. I mean, it's not even close. Basically, FDR wins every state except for Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and I think Connecticut. I mean, it's not really a fair swing. Just for any of you guys thinking about running for office later on, don't attack veterans with the Army. That's just historically, that's not been a very good idea. As our country, even if we could do more for them, we do at least believe that we respect our veterans, and that's not a bad thing. So, and in the first 100 days, when he comes into office, you guys hear like every time a new president comes in, people are like, what's their first 100 days? What's their first 100 days? And people use that term as if that's what you want to look at. Guys, it was the Great Depression whenever they did that the first 100 days. You had to move fast if you were FDR. People don't have to move that fast now. If we're in the middle of a crisis, yes, first 100 days. But if we're having a regular, the world's not in the middle of a crisis, give folks some time. It's usually a better idea if people can have some time to think about the bills they're passing. But in this case, Roosevelt comes in, and the interesting thing is, as I said, he relies upon the experts around him. And one of my just bias, one of my favorite people in 20th century history in terms of thinking and brilliance, at least I would say government category, Francis Perkins. Francis Perkins is later on going to be the person who pushes for all these crazy radical reforms like a 40-hour work week and a minimum wage and Social Security so that regular people can retire. And the thing I love about her is she was fierce, but she was smart. I had you guys do a reading about her just before spring break, if you can remember when that was. She understood people, but when FDR came to her and said, I want you to be my Secretary of Labor, this is my favorite part. Frances Perkins was offered a position which would have made her the first ever female presidential cabinet member. That in itself is a big deal. And instead of saying, oh, yes, this is great, she says to FDR, yeah, but before I accept, let me make clear, I've got this agenda of things that I want to push for. I want to make workers' lives better, and I believe this is the best way to do it. So I suggest that if you don't actually plan to do these things that I'm going to tell you to do, that you don't appoint me because you will have more trouble than is worth for you. And essentially FDR goes, okay. And she is the person, the mastermind behind a lot of the great ideas that come out of New Deal in terms of legislation. And she is another person who is smart. I mean, she knows that there are radicals that are around. She knows that there are people in the labor movement even, which she's very for unions, but she's also wary that there are communists who are trying to cause problems. So she really balances it out, and she figures out a way to, at least for those who are working, make people's lives better. So he's surrounded by some pretty amazing people, and that is the heart of a lot of the New Deal. The Democrats, they sweep the 32 elections. I mean, you go from the 1926 elections, where you have the Republicans dominating everything. By 1932, you have a huge majority in the House, a huge majority in the Senate, and you have the presidency for the Democrats. And that's a big deal after a decade of essentially being the outsider party. Now, I'll wrap up now by talking about what I think is one of the big policies here with the first 100 days, and this has to do with banking reform. If you remember, it's funny, I keep on saying this, if you remember before spring break, I feel like everything has happened since before spring break, so I literally am not surprised if you guys are fuzzy on some of this, because I was like, hey, I'll see you guys after spring break, and then there was a plague, and there were locusts, and the Nile ran blood, and everything, so that's why I'm trying to remind you guys a lot. Yeah, Matt Klaus says March has been such a long year. It has. It's ridiculous. It's the Ohio of months. I don't know if you ever drive from one end of Ohio to the other, you're like, where was I? I used to say when I drove from North Carolina up to Michigan when I lived there, that the people say, how long does it take? I'd be like, well, it takes 12 hours, but 15 of those hours are in Ohio. It seems like it never ends. But yeah, it's been rough, but here we are. So I told you that one of the major problems has to do with when this depression happens, it really shakes up banking. So all these banks had lent money to people to buy stocks, and the collateral was stock and the real estate and all of this, and it goes under, and the banks don't have any money to pay people who just put like money in savings accounts. You can imagine that is a problem. So people don't believe in banks, and if they don't believe in banks, the banks don't have money to loan to help people, and if banks don't have money to loan to help people, nobody who even has a good idea and wants to start a business can do that. So how do you solve that? Well, the first thing FDR does, he comes in, he calls a special session of Congress. He's nominated in March. He's the last president to be nominated in March. The 20th Amendment had just passed in January of 1933. After this, presidents will be inaugurated in January like they are now. He comes in, calls an emergency session of Congress, and starts passing laws. They declare a bank holiday. At this point, more than half of the states in the United States had just suspended banking altogether. There's no more banking. People would refuse to put their money in. So the first thing they do is we're going to shut these banks down, and we're only going to open them back up after we've gone in and verified that they're reliable. Because you think about it, if you don't know if a bank has money or not, and you don't know their position, you're not going to put your money in the bank. So what FDR is saying is, and what the Democrats here and the whole federal government are saying is, we're going to shut them down. We're going to look into them. And when we discover, like when we look at their books, if they are not reliable, we're closing them. But if they are reliable, we will open them back up. That way, you know, anyone that opens back up is going to be one that has been vetted so you can trust them. He does that. Secondly, they get to work on what's called the Glass-Steagall Act. It's a series of acts that are passed later on that year. One of them requires that commercial banks, in other words, banks like savings and loan banks that lend out money to people to buy houses and things like that, you know, basic, that and the institutions that invest in stocks and bonds, they're totally separated. So if you want to be like an investment bank, you want to be a bank that makes its money, you know, that deals in markets, you can't take deposits from people anymore. You can't have a savings account or a checking account. You got to do one or the other. That way, no one who invests their money in a savings and loan type bank has to worry that it's going to go away if there's another stock market crash. So boom, there's that. And then finally, you get the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which you guys know when you walk in a bank, it's like FDIC insured, like on the, yeah. And that basically says that the federal government will insure your money up to a certain amount. So we only let this bank open back up because it's a good bank, but just to show you that we're putting our money where our mouth is, if this bank shuts down, we're going to pay you back a certain amount of the money that's in there anyway. And it's an amount that's high enough to where any common person, that would cover what an average person's savings account was. So all of this, they start pushing to create security there. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about the labor programs and putting people to work. And side note, this is kind of cool. In the next lecture, one of my best friends is an executive at the Directors Guild of America, which is the union that represents all of the biggest directors in Hollywood. Like he's worked with like Steven Spielberg, like all these guys. And he's also a friend of mine. We did our master's degree in history together. So in the next lecture that I do tomorrow night, my friend Steven from the Directors Guild is going to come in and do like a short segment on how the New Deal affected film production and affected the directors in Hollywood, and how the directors used that to essentially secure rights in Hollywood, which is pretty fantastic story. So there we go. All right, now, any questions? Anybody? I'm killing it. This is just like regular class. This is just like I'm like any questions, and you guys are like, no, we had so many, and you answered them all in such a short period of time. Uh, yeah, so I guess that's good. Hey, listen. All right, let's check the chat here. You guys have been chatting it up. All right, lots of Vegas talk. Darkness covered the land. Thank you guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh yeah, especially better than a textbook. Oh man, like I had to throw that option in there. Whenever I was like, what would you like to replace the online thing? And I was like, gave you guys three options, and it was like all lecture, lecture supplemented with other sources, or textbook. I felt like the fourth thing I wanted to put in there just after textbook was like having nails shoved underneath your fingernails. That's ridiculous. Who would want a textbook? That's sad, man. If somebody was like, definitely a textbook, please God. It doesn't yell. It doesn't prance around anywhere. I've got so much to cover, and I already have limited time. If you have any questions that you can think of, like I just did a lecture on a lot, and I covered it quickly. If there's anything in between that you want to know the answer to, either I'll put it into a lecture or I'll just post a video answering your questions. Like I want to be useful to you guys, and I want to give you guys the education you deserve. So thank you so much for being here for this, and I'm here for you.